Well, hello everyone, and here we are again. And this is the series of lectures at the College of New Jersey, and it's called From Caves to Cathedrals, and it seems that we are at the cathedrals now. Even though it appears that we'll actually have kind of skipped over at some point and don't do the art of Byzantium, but it seems that we may be able to fit it in the end. So we are at the cathedrals. We had looked at the Romanesque cathedrals before last lecture, and today we are fast forwarding into Gothic, and one can almost name the date. Sometimes in the summer, in the year 1140, almost towards the middle of the 12th century, AD of course, in right outside the town of Paris. Well, today it's Saint-Denis is part of Paris. In the Abbey of Saint-Denis, one abbot Suger inaugurated the new church, the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, in the presence of Louis VII, his king and his friend, and his beautiful, extremely wealthy wife, Eleanor Aquitaine, who will consequently leave him and marry the future Henry II of England. But it's the same Eleanor of Aquitaine, right here. There's Aquitaine. The church still stands. This is the church this is freshly cleaned up, and this one less cleaned, but still very lovely and very evocative. You may wonder what happened to the North Tower. Well, it was there. Oops. Just a second. This is the original design by the Abbot Suger, and then this is what was built, and it was there towards the end of the 19th century. But then the construction was deemed unsafe, and cracks appeared, so they decided to eliminate the North Tower, and which, you see, originally it was very much like Suger's original plan. And then of course they wanted to rebuild. Well, they never did.
It kind of looks like that Gothic thing with the second tower with that Gothic pile on top of it. Right there with the image you just had. That one.
Oh, this one, yes.
This ornate.
Oh, yes, oh, sure. Yeah.
It it doesn't seem to fit into this
right,
one.
Right.
It kind of looks like when a deer.
The steeple, right?
It kind of looks like when a deer injures itself and one side of its antlers starts growing horribly. Oh. And all of a sudden its head starts leaning and the antler needs to be amputated.
Right here.
This looks like an antler.
Right. Well, it was eliminated. This Abbot Suger, you spell it S-U-G-E-R, was from a very humble family, but however humble it is, he entered Saint-Denis as a little boy, as a novice, and it just so happened that the future King of France was also there for his education, and the two boys actually became friends. But in addition to that, Suger grew in an extraordinarily intelligent, far-seeing man, a great scholar, a great writer, friends of great scholars. And he was also a brilliant diplomat, and St. Louis would send him to Italy to the Pope. He negotiated treaties. He was a chief advisor to Louis VI, the father of Louis VII. He will also continue to advise Louis VII, and in fact, when Louis VII and his queen went on a crusade, which was a disastrous crusade, and Suger told him so, he in fact was left as a regent of France. He was in fact the king in all but name of France for quite a while, and exercised his duties with great responsibility, foresight, and wisdom. He became an abbot of Saint-Denis, and as an abbot he realized that the church was just too small, because this was, remember, the age of pilgrimages, and the church possessed a number of relics. It was even said that Christ himself at some point blessed some of its walls, so it wouldn't be easy to just break the walls that Christ blessed. But changes were absolutely necessary, because there was just not enough room for all the pilgrims. And I mean, Gothic is such a pregnant term. It encompasses so much. I mean, we've seen groin vaults in Normandy, and we saw pointed arches in Cluny, and all these things had already happened. It did not come together as one really divine concept until Saint-Denis. And in order really to understand Gothic, we must also sort of understand that the mindset of the Middle Ages, and it was not a rational mindset as well, hopefully we possess. It was one believed in supernatural. One completely believed in supernatural. Supernatural was a reality, much more so than the reality itself. And Gothic, the Gothic cathedral, came to represent, in actual terms, that supernatural reality. A cathedral as a house of God was an accepted concept, but this was more. It was almost fearful as manifestation of God's presence. It was the symbolic vision, of the supernatural. And the only way really to appreciate and to understand the supernatural. It was a revelation. It was not just presentation. It was a revelation in the mind of the man. We will also be well advised to remember that, the first millennium since Christ's birth, Western society was not at all interested, nor were they really aware, for the most part, in pagan antiquity, with the exception, of course, of things like Charlemagne and his school. But after in the beginning of the second millennium, and then the pilgrimages, the Islamic culture right across the Pyrenees in Spain, and by that time the Islamic scholars, and that was the golden age of Islamic culture, had translated the likes of Aristotle and Pythagoras and Plato, and it began to sieve into France. I mean, into the minds of men.
Seep,
well, through a sieve.
Oh yeah, through a sieve. Yeah,
yeah. Sieve. Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
I see. So,
yeah, seeps. Yeah, that kind of thing.
So parts of it came through.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So there was a great fascination with it, because clearly there was this incredible world long before Christ that built, that represented, that thought, that acted completely unaware of Christ's existence, and yet achieved just stupendous things. And so the intelligent minds of the West began to, well, scratch their heads, because I mean, they were devout Christians, and of course they couldn't even imagine that this existed without Christ's presence. So somehow Christ's presence had to be explained in all these pre-Christian activities, and thus was ultimately born the medieval scholasticism, not so much scholarship, scholasticism, where through very, very complex dialectics one would try to bring together particularly Aristotelian thought, and which is pagan, and Christian theology, which, as I said, was very, very, very complex. So, Abbot Suger was very much among those intellectuals. And when he thought about his new building, he wished to present something that reflected man's understanding of the universe, that reflected the universe as was understood at the time, which of course was hierarchical. But so it was not just a beautiful building or a functional building that could accommodate a lot of people, as a pilgrimage church was. To him now, the cathedral became a philosophical thought in itself. What also added matters, or confused matters, added matters, is that Saint-Denis was a saint, the patron saint of France and of Paris in particular. And this church of which was actually dedicated to Saint Stephen before. Well, there was actually a church there before. There were many until this one began to be built. They found there. They found a manuscript of one Dionysus. It was called Dionysus the Areopagite, and who was a mystic from the east of the 6th century, and he talked about light, that light is divine. There's nothing more divine than light, that in our understanding we can only comprehend divinity through light. The revelation through light, sort of later on, it will also make a great impression when and help create such thing as stained glass windows, because in terms of this luminous theory, and this Dionysus was in fact equated with Saint-Denis, Saint-Denis, which were clearly completely different people if the first one existed in the first place. And so as the light comes through the glass, for instance, a colored glass, say red glass, blue glass, and it changes its essence. The light becomes blue, or the light becomes red or yellow, without breaking the window. Sort of the same way as the incarnation of Christ, where the words of God through Gabriel reached the body of Mary, and an incarnation happened within her body without breaking her virginity. So all of this was...
It's kind of beautiful.
Yeah,
Saying that
it was.
stained glass windows are like divine light.
Well, that's very much...
Suger
certainly very much felt that. So it was a symbolic vision. Yeah, excuse me.
No. I mean.
Yeah, so it was sort of a symbolic vision, and now our abbot began to think of his church as the manifestation of that vision. I mean, ultimately, the walls of a Gothic cathedral will just become porous, will become transparent. They'll become like Belgian lace, really, and we'll see how it will happen, through which lies just poured into the inside, and not a single area of the interior could possibly be in the dark. I mean, yeah, it is. It's a very beautiful concept. Not only that, but as the walls became transparent, and as the walls really ceased to be walls, but became supports, think New York skyscrapers. A medieval cathedral was the first skyscraper.
Wow.
Because they wished to be closer and closer to God, higher and higher, and less of a wall, more and more of a glass.
Mm-hmm.
So glass became wall. So
interesting.
Yeah, it's the same concept essentially as modern art hasn't invented much, has it? As a skyscraper, and but that of course is ahead of time. But this is the man who thought very much ahead of his time, and as a result, he will create he will create a style, unlike Romanesque, that lasted for about 150 years, and was very individual in different parts. Gothic, in fact, will, because of this encompassing theory, Gothic will become very consistent. Well, certainly in France, and then when it's spilled into Germany. England, of course, will will be very individualistic, and of course Italy. Italy will never quite accept Gothic we'll talk about the reasons for that as well. But throughout France and in Germany, it was quite consistent. It will also develop an incredible competitive momentum, because the moment one church was built and some methods were found to make the walls thinner and thinner and the windows larger and larger, then it would immediately be incorporated in the next church, and further advantages were found. So it was sort of like our computer age. The moment you buy a computer today and then a year later it's obsolete, same thing with the Gothic. The moment one church was built, and then the next one already went far ahead, and then in the old church, then they would destroy what they had built before and try to incorporate new features.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it was sort of, yes, as we take our computer to be rebooted, for instance, to a computer specialist, and he just wipes out the entire computer and reloads it with new programs and tells us, well, this is like a new computer. So the same thing with this. This is the best analogy I can think of, except there they would literally take it down, wipe it out, and start anew. It also will exist for at least 400 years in its pure shape, and much longer in just using the so-called Gothic features. I mean, that's being used today still. It is unique in the sense, unique is not competitive with consistent, unique in the sense that this is the first truly original architectural principle that appeared since the Romans. So, and in this respect, nothing like this ever existed, not among Egyptians, not Mesopotamians, the Greeks, the Romans, nothing. This was completely, totally, entirely unique. So that's another one. And as I began to try to explain, it expressive in the sense of incorporating the entire cosmology of men, and all the experiences of men. It was all part of it. Gothic cathedrals. The and and in terms of walls, as I said, the transparency of the walls, well, that of course eliminates sort of the necessity, say, of fresco painters, because architect became more important than the painter. Say in the Romanesque cathedral, sometimes instead of having a gallery, you just have a plain wall that's hiding something. So that plain wall would be St. Michael at Hildesheim, for instance, would be painted or would be frescoed. Now the effort is not to have a wall, so there would be no space for painting, which is why the Italians never quite adopted Gothic, because Italians just couldn't exist without painting, and so Gothic did not find a good did not fall on topsoil in Italy. So as I said, so the builder, the architect becomes more important than in fact the painter, and the aesthetic values of Gothic ultimately will become very linear, particularly vertical, because everything will tend towards the high values. It will be seen as sort of a link between God and men. Let's see. So this is just to show the medieval philosophy, the one I told you, the scholasticism. What it is combined pagan philosophy, mainly Greek, and some of its Roman versions, but Roman versions were just offshoots of the Greek versions. With the new Christian religion, it also seasoned it with a variety of flavorings from Jewish and Islamic intellectual heritages, because, as I said, the way the West found out about the Greek thought was through Islam, in fact. And it produced a very volatile brew, as you can imagine, for so many features of Christianity. It just did not fit into cohesive, rational, classical viewpoint. And so as a program, scholasticism was an attempt to harmonize the medieval thinkers on the part of these Christian thinkers, their own tradition, and to reconcile Christian theology with the classical and late antiquity, particularly that of Aristotle and that of Neoplatonism. And they had rediscovered science. They had rediscovered the two basic components of classical education from which everything stems. And one was trivium, and the other was quadrivium. I may have mentioned it before. And trivium was just elementary education. Trivium was grammar, logic, rhetoric. You learned how to read, you learned how to speak, you learned how to think, read and write, of course. So that's the three basic elements upon which then the next component is built, which is quadrivium. And that's where we get the name trivial. It's trivial because it comes from trivium. And then quadrivium now was the sciences. It is it's geometry, it's astronomy, it is musical theory, geometry, astronomy, musical theory. And there's a fourth one. Astronomy was linked to geometry, astronomy, well, obviously arithmetic, just basic arithmetic. Later on, architecture will be part of it, and in fact, it's beginning to be part of it, because with this, with mathematics in general, in fact, began to be seen as very much part of God, of God's design, because as God designed the universe, He used geometry, He used mathematics. And that's when this medieval illumination, this manuscript came into being. And the architect, therefore, and in fact Sujet as well, sort of saw himself very much as part of this process. So science, and particularly geometry and astronomy, was linked directly to the divine for most medieval scholars, because now that they had discovered Euclid and they discovered Pythagoras, they discovered the majority of the ancient scientists and what they thought about it in terms of creation, they became utterly and completely fascinated by it. Since God created the universe after geometric and harmonic principles, which is musical theory, to seek these principles was therefore to seek and worship God. And in fact, that's what the scholastic thought will apply in terms of building a cathedral, certainly a Gothic cathedral. Now, did people like Suger or other abbots of other cathedrals, who were all extraordinary men of their days, did they have amazing architects? I mean, an architect was not really a profession at the time. People were builders, and they would come. It became very international. They would bring builders from other parts, because Ile-de-France, which is the area around Paris, and which was under the which was the area that was under the influence and under the power of the king immediately. I mean, technically the whole France was, but the fact is different parts of France were ruled by extremely strong barons, who very often were much wealthier than the King of France, and possessed much more land. I mean, to give you an example today, when you think of Monaco, for instance, of the little kingdom of Monaco, or Luxembourg, these are the leftovers of those areas that were separate, that technically owed allegiance to the King of France, perhaps, but did not act on it, because they were very, very powerful barons, as I said, in their own right. And but this is the time when the French kings begin to consolidate their rule, in fact, and begin to claim more and more universal authority. And that was much to do with the building of the cathedrals and with the influence of these extraordinary abbots, who for the most parts were on the side of the king and claimed almost spiritual authority, not quite on par with the popes of Rome, but in their own areas, yes. Where was I? Okay. Science, mathematics. So, and it's not that they could calculate the stresses in these cathedrals. And I know where I was. So the King of France was was really autonomous and powerful around this, at this point, a relatively small area of Ile-de-France. And interestingly, there weren't really interesting buildings there, because we had seen incredible cathedrals in Normandy with the groin vaults, and incredible cathedrals in Burgundy, and of course beautiful cathedrals in the south of France. But Ile-de-France itself didn't possess much, but now was its time. And Suger himself had to bring workers from far away. He even considered at one point to go to Rome and loot the classical columns, because that's what everybody did. I mean, there were classical columns lying all over the place. Why not just bring them over? But fortunately, the stone quarries were discovered in the Ile-de-France, and they were plentiful, and so they were used. So they didn't go elsewhere. Let's see. He rebuilt the choir, completely new, and we'll look at the choir. And then he rebuilt the facade, as you see. And the facade he now articulated. very carefully articulated into 3 definite bays, as you see here, with 3 different entrances. And should we just go to the actual church? Yeah.
It's interesting, when it's dirtier, you actually
see more, right?
the definition much better.
I know, right?
I mean,
Yeah.
don't get me wrong, I very much appreciate that someone spent the time and money to clean and restore.
But this looks better, you're right.
But for the sake of actually seeing the detail.
Because the light of shadow and shadow.
Light and
Here's
shadow.
the example of the light and shadow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm happy that it's clean.
Of course, because it's going to get dirty soon enough. But yes, here's the case of the light and shadow, and in painting as well.
Yeah.
Don't forget about the light and shadow, because you define the image so much better.
It's interesting how often things, when they look rustic, look better. I mean, I realize that.
Right. Yes.
Like you have the Greek statuary, which would it have looked good with all that color, or would it have looked really tacky? And this, and just all sorts of things where...
Oh, believe me, when they started cleaning the ceiling in the Sistine Chapel, oh my God, there was so many...
Yeah, well, that is the case
thank God they did
for
it,
the opposite.
Also it was really not good for the ceiling, all that grime on top of it. But I can't tell you how many dissertations written on the deep and sonorous feeling of Michelangelo's earthly color sense in his understanding of the divine.
Cool.
Yeah. So he divides the facade. There's much of the Romanesque still, and of course Romanesque will still exist for a long time. The parts of it. So much of the Romanesque here, he divides the facade into 3 very definite bays, and what does it remind us of, really? I mean, the Roman gates. When we do Roman art in the summer, if we do it, Romans would encompass, the early Romans, the cities with fortifications, and there would be main gates into the city. There would be actually 4 gates. The Cardo and Tecumanus, and then there would be 4 gates. Well, for Suger, because the cathedral was a house of God, the front entrance was the heavenly gate into the house of God. Look, even the crenellation is here. I mean, this is a church, but even the crenellation is there because, and he felt that building itself, sort of, while he was building, he was divine. Building itself is a spiritual process, the way he felt about it. And the whole universe is sort of a symphonic composition where everything has to sing and come together, and where every instrument has to complement and enhance another instrument. There was this huge orchestra that was orchestrated by God, and even with his vaults, because he found the deposits of ashlar, which is very kind of light stone. As a result, the vaulting in the nave will be built long after Suger's death, but it's just half the weight. So he divides his gates into 3 parts, and the most important gate, of course, leads into the nave, and then he'll increase the space inside with side aisles. It is he who came up with the idea of a rose window, and the reason it's called a rose window is because, well, it sort of looks like a rose, and to insert a rose window up there into the clerestory, essentially, gave light again to the nave. But then let's not forget also that stained glass itself will ultimately dim the interior. And the best way, of course, to see it is during sunlight, when it goes through and then the light is really bright and the glass becomes like jewel. But as I said, and in the future, there'll be much of the stained glass will be destroyed for that very reason, because more light was was required in the interior. And then, so this is the opening into the nave, and this is the lighting of the nave, and also on each side. So one, you see, it's everywhere the same. One a portal, then three, one actual window and two blind arches, then the stained glass, and here you have a portal, becomes again one window, two blind arches, and then three same composition repeated up above. So it was all very interesting and very new, and we saw what happened to the towers. Also with the towers, you see, there's an attempt to eliminate the wall. The first story are just two elongated round windows, not round windows, but the elongated windows with arched windows right there. But there on the top now it kind of becomes one window, which is separated into three parts with columns right here. And this is, we already begin to see how the wall is being eliminated. Even in the front, where it was felt that cutting in more windows perhaps would weaken the wall, but nevertheless, then instead of the windows, then the builders would relieve the wall, would decorate the wall with blind arches, just so that the entire facade would read together and create, in fact, light and shadow. Light and shadow with these four massive buttresses in the front, light and shadow with innumerable colonnettes and blind windows, and make the facade dissolve, sort of flicker. So that was the beginning of that attempt. This is what Suger envisioned, very symmetrical. This is what we ultimately got, and then the North Tower was eliminated. Okay. Today, the only thing, later in the 13th century, as I said before, because of innovations elsewhere, the whole thing was rebuilt, and in fact Suger's choir was eliminated as well. But so the only thing that's left of Suger's really brilliant idea is the ambulatory, I mean a little bit of a choir and the ambulatory. The Suger's apse, the whole thing was eliminated, but a bit of the choir and ambulatory remained. And when you look at it, the first thing that kind of hits us is that, well, there are no walls. I mean, it's all supports. There are just no walls at all. And if you look at the plan, what we see here, those that appear to be walls, what they really are, those are huge buttresses that are holding up the vaulting right there. All of these are groin vaults that you see with the lines, and then columns, 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 and columns, and groin vaults. The whole, everything you see, in fact, windows became walls. And all the columns are doing is upholding these vaults and the groin vaults. We are very fortunate because Suger was a scribbler and wrote copious amounts, and he wrote about the building of his beloved church, of course. And there he wrote about, let me see, here. They're the groins, you see. This is the webbing, this is the groins. But then the actual masonry, the ribs were introduced, and it's the ribs, in fact, that held all the weight and that directed the weight. Here, you see, this is the ribs right there, and directed the weight into these piers and into the columns. And he wrote that at one point there was a huge storm, and the space in between the ribs hadn't been filled in with masonry yet, and yet everything, and then the ribs held. And he definitely saw it as a sign of God, because God as architect, God as mathematician was feeling compassionate, and also Saint-Denis was sort of his representative on earth at that moment. the so here's just another example of this. You can see, I mean, obviously the columns are very large, but even the columns, you see, are given the little colonnettes which dissolve the mass of the column. But otherwise, these are these enormous piers that are supporting these groin walls, and you can see the groins that are introduced. Each groin, you see, goes into a colonnette. So what happens here is just everything is filled with energy and everything is filled with function. There's nothing decorative or non-functional. And that was the idea, that everything is, as I said, filled with energy and filled with purpose. So in a Gothic cathedral, there would not be just plain walls that could be decorated or some decorative spaces that perhaps not needed there. Everything has a function, and that's what these are. Sujet also began to use the local leaves and local forests to do his capitals, not necessarily Corinthian capitals. So here's Saint-Denis, and then to the northwest of Paris, soon after that, the Cathedral of Laon will be built or rebuilt. I mean, all these cathedrals existed as a Romanesque cathedrals at first, but then soon, as Gothic began to sweep through the land, a very surprising number of old Romanesque cathedrals caught on fire, because it seemed that every town wanted a Gothic cathedral now. Now, Laon is, it appears at first glance as slightly unwieldy, and again, we don't exactly know which part was constructed. I suspect the gables may have been constructed later. The entrances now, as you see with Saint-Denis, they're rather shallow. They're part of the wall still, whereas in Laon, the portals are much deeper. Now there's this new thing of making a considerably deeper portal, and in fact cut everything much deeper, cut through the masonry to show, first of all, how thick the masonry could be, but yet their incredible talent at making it weightless. So even though the windows are splayed, but as they are splayed, all these colonnades are introduced, and archvolts. Remember the archvolts from last lecture, and everything is decorated with sculpture now, and we will talk about cathedral sculpture soon enough. And here too, you see more and more of a non-space. The rose window is becoming really luxurious and very, very large. Windows on each side, like the side aisles, and rose window would light the nave. The colonnade, the galleries here, and again the towers are splayed to give them, because they're octagon, and then up on the towers there are sculptures of the bulls. Here, hold on, I'll show you. Yeah, sculptures of the bulls, and then you see the pointed windows is introduced throughout, because a cathedral was a universal enterprise also. It was quite astonishing that the lords and ladies would in fact join the peasantry and the builders in building the cathedral, because the spiritual value of it, the spiritual inspiration was such as united the town. and it actually became probably the greatest economic enterprise of the Middle Ages, of the high, these are called the High Middle Ages, because, I mean, everybody was involved. I mean, the architects, the builders, the masons, the sculptors, the stone cutters, the glass blowers, the stained glass makers, the textiles, and also all these cathedrals. They all had very substantial relics, and they attracted huge numbers of population. And all these people would come and bring with them their coin or bring something for bartering and take something with them. And so they really became the symbol of a town's corporate existence, these cathedrals. Laon's economy, in fact, was booming by the 12th century. I mean, even earlier, already in the 11th century. And so Anselm of Laon's had a school of theology in and that's where schools were at that time. By the 13th century, universities will take over from the cathedrals. So the cathedral schools will kind of transform themselves into universities, such as University of Paris, for instance. But at this point, it is still the cathedrals that are very much the centers of learning. So his school of theology was becoming one of the most acclaimed in Europe, and more students were coming, and therefore it was very much felt that, again, the cathedral should be larger. So a Lyon communal charter was reestablished, and by the mid-12th century, the construction began and was pretty much completed well under 100 years. But that doesn't mean that additions were not being made afterwards. It was in fact planned originally. There are 5, oh, here you can see the bulls here as well. And these gargoyles, they direct water. Let me see. No, I don't have a map. It was originally planned for 7 towers. That's a lot of towers. But you know, the towers rise upwards, and they don't need to be. Well, they still need to be supported, but of course it's not like the bull. But ultimately they ended up with 5 towers, but 7 in fact were planned. The interior, and here we have the interior of Laon, and you remember, I mean, this is the middle of the 12th century. Gothic had just barely been born. It was born, as I said, 1140. We know the date. The interior still has round columns, as in the Roman Basilica. And the Roman Basilica is still the core of it all. And the acanthus leaves are very stylized this time. And we can see why. I mean, to do a real acanthus leaf capital would take, I think, a couple of months. And then it's a very, very, well, you know, the really elaborate one is spectacular. And it takes incredible skill to do that sort of thing. So these are stylized. The elevation, this is the elevation. That's what's called the elevation. Just to see how many stories. Here, for instance, the elevation is 1, 2, 3, 4. Sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, but this one is very tall. Also, the 4-partite elevation. The elevation is what you're looking at as you're looking at the structure. And the first story is the naval arcade that consists of these columns that they're sort of like soldiers that bring us towards the ultimate goal, the altar. And then the second story is the gallery, right here. Then the 4th is a triforium. And when you get the, I'll post the PowerPoint, and you'll see that triforium essentially is just an opening in the thickness of the wall. You can see the wall behind it right there. And it's divided into 3 parts. And its purpose, again, is just really just to dissolve the wall, to make the wall seem like a lace. So the triforium, and then we have clerestory. And then towards the end, these three are called the lancet windows. They kind of look like lancets. And then there is another rose, and there is also, of course, a huge rose in the western entrance. The cathedrals, for the most part, were oriented east-west. So this would be east. We're standing in the west, east, of course, towards the Holy Jerusalem. And the vaulting, as you see, is six-partite. It consists of 6 portions in a bay. That the bay itself then divided between itself. But the ceiling partition consists of 3 groins. And then what they do here is take those groins all the way down to the capital, to make up for the horizontal feeling of the 4-partite elevation. That because the horizontal courses are now compensated by the continuous groins that go all the way to the capitals of the column, and thus take our eyes upwards. Oh, here we do have a plan. Actually, originally, the cathedral had a round apse right here. We don't really know why, who decided to, and most of it, I mean, this seems more like an English plan, really. But in most of the French cathedrals, there's the round apse at the end. But then somebody decided to do this very elongated choir up there. We also have to remember that even with this view towards the end, in most of the cathedrals there was always a screen, a very elaborate sculptured screen, as there are still screens in English cathedrals, for instance. But the majority of those screens were removed, destroyed during the Catholic Counter-Reformation, because they needed to oppose Protestantism, and as such they felt that a direct view towards the altar was needed here, so those screens were removed. But originally there were screens, so the Laon presumably was one of Charlemagne and his descendants' favorite places, and as I said, they had the round east end. And you can see some details about the cathedral if you're interested, and about its windows, its stained glass windows. These are, and here too, and in most of these cathedrals, we will find the representation of liberal arts. Again, trivium, which is grammar, logic, rhetoric, and quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music theatre. So those are the
music theory.
Musical theory. What did I say?
Musical theater.
No, musical theory. Definitely musical theory. Not musical theory. So all of that is because science, as it was understood at the time, and the Gothic cathedral were inseparable. A builder, the abbot, and God were companions in arms in that regard. And thus, of course, we come to the most famous of all cathedrals, and that's Notre Dame in Paris. Also, please note that all these cathedrals, the majority of Gothic cathedrals, are dedicated to the Virgin Mary, because in the 12th century there appeared the worship of the Virgin Mary, which until then, the first millennium was not really that powerful, but with the I mean, didn't really exist, in fact, but with the appearance of chanson de geste and the and chivalry, all of that appeared at the same time, and the image of a woman as something to worship, and at the head of it all was the image of the Virgin Mary, who was, of course, the most perfect, spectacular female of all. And so the majority of these cathedrals now are dedicated to the minstrels. You know, the minstrels would walk around and sing beautiful songs. Whereas the Romanesque cathedrals could be dedicated to saints or Christ or what have you. But the majority of these cathedrals are dedicated to the Virgin Mary, even though Chartres will claim her as their own. But the Notre Dame, which is Our Lady, Lyon also, it's Notre Dame of Lyon, and this is Notre Dame de Paris. And again, presumably there was in times Roman, there was a temple there, perhaps dedicated to Zeus, and then with time there were other churches built in this place dedicated to saints, and then towards already the end of the 12th century, you see, the cathedral began to be built. I mean, they will be built for a long while. I mean, this is the beginning. But what it will introduce, this will probably be one of the first cathedrals using the flying buttress, and I'll explain what a flying buttress is. So it was not originally designed to include them, but after the construction began, and of course there was always this desire to make the walls thinner and thinner, and opening the windows more and more, so the walls began to give, and it was felt that it was necessary to buttress them, to support them. And but what do you do with the side chapels and side aisles? You have to kind of go around them. So as a result, if this is the side chapel here, and this is the wall of the cathedral, this is a flying buttress. It was built like this, and as the wall falls down, the buttress is here to hold it up. And underneath, and it's called flying because it flies over various other construction at the end, at the bottom of the church. As we will see, then all of those are flying buttresses. Here is 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, a four-partite elevation of the cathedral front. It's not quite Saint-Denis, but it follows the same idea as Saint-Denis. It presents a very unified surface. The portals now are fully pointed, and they're also divided, you see, by very pronounced buttresses, just as Saint-Denis was. And again, the portal is not deep, not as deep as Lyon. It was felt that, well, Saint-Denis, you know, is about 5 miles away. Saint-Denis is also part of Paris, and therefore, when constructing Notre Dame, of course, they were looking at Saint-Denis. So the entrances, as I said, the porches are not very deep, and then it was felt necessary to include, because I mean this is a capital, to include the row of kings and queens of France right there. Now we must remember that during the French Revolution, all of this was destroyed. I mean, this statuary came later. The original statuary, or what's left of it, is actually right here across the Seine in Musée de Cluny in Paris, and it has the remnants of what was left of these statues, because the French Revolution considered it all, of course, an abomination, and destroyed as much as possible. The same was true with Saint-Denis. All liturgical treasures, whether gold, silver, it was all melted for just metal itself, and because Saint-Denis, in fact, has the tombs of the kings going back, the Capetian kings, even before Capetians, going back to the Merovingians. All of that was scattered, It was found later on
okay.
and reinstalled, but a lot of it is broken.
Jesus.
Yeah, and then the same thing here. The same, because of course, I mean, these are the two cathedrals that were felt were immediately connected, not only with the church, which, but of course with the French kingship. So the row of this, this is replaced. And then again, it's all very logical, very beautiful. The two windows, this time there are no blind arches as there are in Saint-Denis. So these are actual windows that light the side aisles, and then a beautiful rose that lights the nave. And then on the separating, the third level is a lace, is a lace of stone. I mean, you can hardly call it anything else. This is a lace of stone. Some of it, the intersecting arches, are almost Islamic, as we saw. Remember, as we saw in the cathedral at Monreale in Sicily, those intersecting arches that were clearly taken from Islamic motifs, and at this point, and we'll see more of it. At this point, there's a great connection between France and Sicily. In fact, Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter is married to one of the kings of Sicily, and so there's much connection, both the diplomatic and the connection of friendship, family, intellectual, of course, without question, because in the 12th century, as you remember from last lecture, Sicily became really the foundation of Renaissance. That's where it all began. That's where the kings of Sicily were Norman dukes originally, and they had the texts translated from Islamic into Latin, and of course the cultural exchange was constantly enacted. So these intersecting arches remind us very much of the Islamic influences, and you can in fact see the roof of the cathedral through that lace, and that's the point. And again, the towers again, you can see the cloche, you can see the large bells. Interestingly, wasn't there a story that the French wanted to destroy the cathedral, and then Hugo wrote right?
Yeah,
And then Victor Hugo wrote
so apparently,
the Hunchback.
Yeah, apparently it had relapsed into such state of disrepair that
Right.
the French government was trying to decide, well, is like the tower, is it even worth fixing, or should we just
eliminate it,
tear it down so
like
it doesn't
the North Tower,
so it doesn't fall a gargoyle doesn't fall on someone's head. So they were really trying to figure it out, and Victor Hugo just absolutely freaked because it was his favorite. So he proceeded to write
the Hunchback of Notre Dame.
He wrote Notre Dame fan fiction, and it saved Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Never give up on your dreams.
Exactly. In fact, gargoyles, we'll talk about gargoyles presently, but gargoyles, the ones that water pipes, those were go back to the 13th, 14th century. But the ones, the chimeras that are just sitting there as decoration, they are from the time when it was from the 19th century.
Oh, really? Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, those came later. So let's see. Notre Dame, of course, had its own relics, and then in the 13th century, Saint Louis IX, also brought there the relics of the True Cross and the relics of Passion that he purchased from the Venetians, actually. And at this point, the Sainte-Chapelle is the royal chapel that we'll look at as well, was being built. So he deposited those relics in Notre Dame. And now let's look at the plan again, because plans are important in in cathedrals. So what immediately strikes our eyes is that the transept is almost flush with the walls, because well, it's a big city, and there was just not enough room to extend the transept arms. But the crossing is there, of course, and then it has exactly half the size of bass in the choir as it does in a way. And here the vault, you see, is still sexpartite. It still has the 6 partitions as the one in Laon. You know, the more relics were being brought, the more space was needed, and finally these space between the buttresses was in fact enclosed, and it was all turned into additional chapels for other saints. So, which of course introduced darkness as well, but the cathedral is well lit today. But this is what's interesting here, and here you really see the progression, the medieval progression of the Gothic cathedral.
Oh, wow.
You see, this is what you see here in the transept is the original 1, 2, 3, 4 4-partite elevation, as we had seen in Laon. The 1, the 2, the 3, the 4. It's just instead of a triforium, we have sort of a little rose, and quite a bit of plain wall. But soon enough, it was felt, because other cathedrals were being built around, and it was felt that, well, this is very archaic. We have to open it more. So what they started to do, they eliminated this in most of the part. They rebuilt all this. And instead of the triforium, you see, and instead of this window, they introduced what is called a plate tracery.
Wow.
Right.
Oh, that's funky.
They made now a 3-partite elevation instead of 4-partite elevation. Here we still have 1, 2, 3, 4, and here we have 1, 2, 3. And the wall is kind of transparent again. So there is a combination of a rose with 2 lancet windows, or there could be 3 or 4 or what have you. We'll see more. This is called a plate tracery. And a lot more light, or colored light, would now come through, and here is where the flank buttress was certainly needed, and the flank buttress would actually hit where at the springing point of a vault, so it would take upon itself, if the vault is here under the roof, if the vault is here, the flank buttress would take the pressure and bring it into the ground. Yeah, is that understandable?
Yeah, of course.
Sometimes in class, what I do, I ask somebody from class to come and stand and lean towards me. And then I hold my hands so the person wouldn't fall. And I become the flying buttress, and the person becomes the wall.
Do you want me to? I think
that's
good.
okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. No.
Thank you.
Yeah. But as you see in the transept, we still see the old design, and it still has a gallery. It has a gallery. The naval arcade. Now see what is happening now with the groins. The groins, they're pitched here at the vault, and they, well, actually, you know what? I think it's the same as Laon. Yes, because Notre Dame still has cylindrical columns, but the groins go all the way up, and it is still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it is still a 6-partite division. This is just to show you what the flying buttresses done. An important innovation in the 13th century is the flying buttresses. Before that, all the weight of the roof pressed onward and into the ground, but then, of course, there was a danger that the walls will just fall apart because there isn't enough buttressing, or just crumble if you weaken the wall with too many windows. With the flying buttress, the weight was carried by the ribs of the vault entirely outside the structure. So it became exoskeletonal. In other words, you can see inside how the ribs work, how the skeleton of the cathedral works, but then outside that skeleton was caught up by the buttresses and took it, and the skeleton was taken outside, so it's exoskeletonal structure, it was called. The weight was carried to the ribs, entirely outside the structure, you see, to a series of counter supports which were topped with these pinnacles. And they're not just decorative, these pinnacles, they're also sort of like nails, because they were heavy, and so they assured the downward weight, which gave them greater weight. Yeah, there it is. Cross section of the double support. Oh, this one is it was done by Viollet-le-Duc in the 19th century, as he imagined it would have been back in the 13th century. I mean, it had been changed since then, of course, because the cathedral did burn many times. It wasn't just the first time that it burnt a year ago. It was several times. So, but this is how the original structure would have looked. And you see, this is where the groins are pinched, right there at the top, and this is where this particular flying buttress meets the pressure, whereas this one then meets the pressure of the roof itself. So every one of them is functional.
That's insane.
I know, it is amazing. And that's what allowed them to build skyscrapers.
It's also, I think, isn't it one of the reasons that it was so important that that those firefighters got in there when they did, because if one of these came down.
Yes. Yeah, here's a little person.
Shout out to the amazing firefighters who went in there and
oh, absolutely.
Saved
yes.
it.
Thank you.
The brave men and women.
Merci. There's the little firefighter.
Yeah. Oh.
I know. In medieval garb. Right, the gargoyles. Gargoyles, the architects use them on buildings to direct the flow of rainwater, to get it off the roof. And a true was cut in the back of the gargoyle. Well, I mean, we all saw the little cartoon, right? The
Hunchback of Notre
the Hunchback,
Dame.
yeah. So we saw the function of the gargoyles. So they're usually an elongated, fantastic animal, because the length of the gargoyle determines how far the water will flow away from the building. But this, you see, there's a difference between gargoyle and chimeras. A chimera is also an imaginative animal, and the chimeras are purely ornamental, whereas gargoyles actually serve for the water. And the term gargoyle originates from French word gargouille, or gargouiller, no, gargouille, meaning throat or gullet. I suppose gargouiller, maybe just
so like the phrase to gurgle?
Exactly. That's, yeah. English words gargle and gurgle.
Ah, there we go.
Same thing. Yeah. And true gargoyles serve the practical purpose of carrying rainwater away from the buildings, whereby preventing deterioration. And as I said, now these actually were done in the 19th century, the chimeras. They were not in the original cathedral. And here you see the chedette, the choir and the ambulatory of Notre Dame, and the flying buttresses, as they all sort of support the vault in there and the roof. And of course, very beautiful. And you can see the plate tracery now from the outside. Plate tracery here and there and over there. Yeah, I mean it's amazing. It's an amazing. They're amazing structures. And now we come to Chartres, which is considered the height of the height of the Gothic cathedral. The most classic of the Gothic cathedrals. This is you were talking about that the North Tower there before, whereas this tower is actually beautiful, the South Tower. Chartres is, let's see, so Paris, Saint-Denis, as you see, they're very next to one another. So the Abbey of Saint-Denis and the Notre Dame are neighbors. Then Laon is to the northwest, and Chartres is to this kind of, south. I mean, Laon is to the northeast, and this is to almost to the east, really, a bit to the south, but mostly to the west. my cardinal points are not my strength. So as you see, it will be built over 100 years again, and things will be changed even later, because what happened? Oh, okay. Now there was a very, very important scholastic school in Chartres. We talked about scholasticism, and in Laon, actually Notre Dame will in fact be one of the beginning of the Paris, of the University of Paris. Notre Dame will be the center. First, it will begin with the School of Scholasticism in Notre Dame, but then the University of Paris on the left bank will expand from that, the Sorbonne. So in the beginning of the 11th century, one Bishop Fulbert established Chartres as a cathedral school, an important center of religious scholarship and theology. As I said, the first millennium after Christ's birth did not wonder about pagan antiquity, but the second millennium, too much information now began to seep through, and people were ready. They were settled, no more invasions. The intellectuals were ready to absorb anew all the extraordinary learning of the pagans. So he attracted important theologians who were in the forefront of the intense intellectual rethinking that culminated in what is now known as the 12th century Renaissance, and Chartres was at the forefront of that Renaissance, pioneering the scholastic philosophy that came to dominate medieval thinking throughout Europe. Now this one is Pythagoras, and we'll see actually the vault where on which Pythagoras is depicted. On one of the arch vaults over the right door of the west portal. I should have brought it in. Here. Okay. It seems that sometime at the end of the 9th century, the Carolingian church that was there acquired the sacred tunic. The sacred tunic that presumably Charlemagne presented to the cathedral, and the sacred tunic was supposed to be the tunic that Mary wore while she was giving birth to Christ. Now, the fact that Charlemagne had never gone to Palestine, I suppose, doesn't change the fact. So, as I said, the Middle Ages, the whole thing was symbolism, and symbolism was very, very real, and no one could possibly doubt the real value of the symbolic piece. It was sort of a symbolic vision. Right. And then and that, of course, as you can imagine, brought an enormous amount of pilgrims to the cathedral. And again, it was very much felt that the cathedral needed to be rebuilt, and in the new style. So rebuilding began with the west portal and all these elements. First the south tower, the north tower, all of this is later addition, is the 14th century, 15th century additions. But first was this part built, then the portal, and then this is a beautiful tower. This really kind of shows very beautiful, clean lines. And not only that, look, it starts kind of it starts square, and then the square, you see, gets subdivided by these blind arcades and little blind colonnades. Then the windows appear, and then they are slashed on the corners, splayed on the corners, and then our eyes completely prepared for the tower to turn octagonal from the square.
It's kind of interesting how the tower that we see on the right, the elegant tower,
right,
the bottom is actually more ornate than the bottom of the left-hand tower.
That's true. Because that was the first.
Yeah, it doesn't have those little frills above the windows. But then, my God, things change
Right.
up when we get further up.
Right. And then look, you see that all those colonnettes at the back. I should have included another slide. Looks like an organ, organ.
Oh, that's
Because they
nice.
just want to eliminate
The
the heavy,
gills. It looks
the
like
heavy
gills.
feeling of this stupendous wall.
What do you think of the left tower?
Oh, it's just a wedding cake,
Yeah, it's
a Gothic wedding cake.
It's funny. It's one of those things where things get lost in the detail.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of looks like a growth.
Oh yeah.
It's beautiful when you get close and can look at the individual details.
It's very intricate. It's just.
But it just
Yeah.
so completely doesn't fit
Yeah.
with the.
Germans would do something like this. Yeah.
But then they do the entire thing like that, and it
I
kind of balances itself out. But the funny, you know what it is? You kind of can't help thinking that underneath all of those curlicues is the original clean-cut tower. And if you were just to take a nice wet cloth and just give it a good scrub, you'd wash off all the mold. And that original tower would be underneath it.
I think from here on, that was already 14th into 15th.
I understand.
Because
I'm
you
just
see
saying
the window.
the impression it gives, yeah.
Not only that, but the windows are done kind of like flames, and that was called the flamboyant style, because into the 13th century the Raynaud style, sort of like the. Hold on. Where's our? Here. This is your Raynaud, the style of sun rays. It's the style of the rays, and that's what it's called. This kind of Raynaud style, and then in Chartres, this is just decorative. They'll begin to look like flames, and that's called flamboyant, from flames. Yeah. Okay, so yes, we did this. Yeah, it's beautiful, this tower, and the way your eye is prepared for the transition from the square to the octagonal and then into the spire is very inspiring.
Boo! Oh God, no!
So they began to do the front portal, you see, and then in the year 94. In the year 94, there was a huge fire. There was an enormous fire. I mean, most of the town was burnt. It was so bad. Nobody knows how, why. And the cathedral, the west front, whatever was there of the west front, stayed. But the rest of the cathedral was completely burned, and it was a Romanesque cathedral, as we remember. I mean, all those cathedrals were Romanesque cathedrals, and that was unimaginable tragedy, because everyone assumed that the tunic, of course, burned in the cathedral as well. And but that tunic, as I said, in the case of Chartres, also was the cathedral was the economic enterprise. Everybody worked for the cathedral. Everybody did something for the cathedral. The noble ladies and gentlemen gave as much donation as possible to the cathedral, and of course the pilgrimage was incredible, and everybody, and of course the shops would sell the copies or small copies of the tunic, as today our museum shops do too, of course. They sell, you go to a Metropolitan Museum of Art and you can see copies of beautiful jewelry in the museum that you can purchase and wear. And that was the same thing with the cathedral. So textile business was very, very strong in Chartres, as well as all the other businesses. And now, without the tunic, the despair, from what we read in the annals, what we read in chronicles, the despair was universal, and in fact, apparently, it reached the fact that the cathedral burned and the tunic burned. the fact reached England, reached Spain, reached Italy, and reached abbeys everywhere. Because Chartres, even though all these cathedrals were dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Chartres felt that go dedicate all you want, but she lives with us. This is what was. Remember the film, Sashka? Remember, Jesus may be
Oh, the Pope.
maybe Catholic.
Might be French, but Jesus was English. You're quoting Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger and Paul Bettany.
Right, Knight's Tale, which is a great film with Keith Ledger.
It's a joke, though. It's not.
Yes, and,
yes.
and Paul Bettany, and there's a scene in a pub in England, and there's the French contingent and the English.
France.
In France.
Yeah, because they're there for a tournament. So the
Okay.
Frenchman says, you know, and besides, the reason that we're better than you is, after all, the Pope himself is French. And the English people get really offended, and one of them says, well, the Pope may be French, but Jesus was English. You're on.
Right. Exactly, that was very funny. That was at the time when the Pope was French, during the time of Avignon captivity. I think we talked about that too. Yeah, that was very funny. So this is how Chartres felt. You may all dedicate your cathedrals to Mary, but she's ours. But now that they lost the tunic, they kind of lost their claim to the tunic, and then, lo and behold, it turned out that the tunic, in fact, was removed to the crypt. The crypt did not burn, and the tunic did not burn either.
It's a miracle!
Well, you're right. And the medieval character, well, as actually a modern character too, was very quickly switched from utter despair into utter glory.
Woo!
And so the whole world rejoiced greatly, and again, money just poured into the rebuilding of this cathedral. Money poured from everywhere into the rebuilding of the cathedral, and in fact, it was seen as divine grace. That it was seen again as another symbol, which was very real. That it was done that conflagration was purposeful with the divine design, and that they must now rebuild the cathedral. And first we're going to look at the it's called the Royal Portal, and it's one of the greatest entrances into a cathedral that ever exist. It's an icon in stone. In fact, I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. It is an icon in stone. As you see, it is shallow. Again, it is not deep. Its north and southern transepts, portals, will be much deeper. But this is quite shallow, and it is just covered with sculpture. Now, we saw sculpture already employed in Saint-Denis, and then in Laon, and in Notre Dame, and here it is the most glorious sculpture, and which at this point is completely part of architecture. As you see, the elongated figures here are columnar figures, except they don't function as columns. They don't function as our caryatides at the Rectium in Athens, where the women become columns and in fact assume the role of a column by holding up the pediment. Here they are exclusively ornamental. Well, not quite, of course, because they also meant to convey a message to those who go through the portals. And then the figures in archvolts, these are the archvolts, just go together with architecture. They follow architecture. And unlike the Romanesque cathedrals, you remember with those last judgments where the eye just doesn't know where to concentrate, you immediately see very clean representation of Christ in mandorla. Mandorla is an almond shape, which I suppose symbolizes the womb from which he sprung, and then he is surrounded by his evangelists in their apportioned places. On the left of Christ at the bottom is Saint Luke, who is represented as a winged bull, and then on the upper left is Saint John, who is represented as an eagle, and then on the lower right is Saint Mark, represented by a winged lion, and on the upper right is Saint Matthew, represented as an angel. And prophets and angels and apostles are beneath him, and everywhere here there is other representations. But what we're going to do now, we're going to go to the right entrance here. Up here, the West Royal Portal of Chartres. So the left and north arch, so this one, the left one, portrays the accession of Christ, and he is drawn upwards by the angels on a cloud, while the apostles look from below. The central porch, just as I said, portrays Christ in glory, and the right, now this one is probably the most interesting of them all, because it celebrates the incarnation of God's wisdom in Christ. And every time we see, and it was a very common image in the Middle Ages of Christ sitting very straightforwardly in Mary's lap, and it's called the throne of wisdom, because it was said in the Middle Ages that divine wisdom was incarnated. This is incarnation, incarnated in Christ. So infant Jesus in the lap of Mary, who in turn is enthroned upon what Christian traditions called the throne of wisdom. But her lap itself kind of becomes a throne of wisdom as well. So this tradition is rooted in a dozen or so passages in the New Testament. So, and here we have it. I mean, the entire Chartres, there's a fellow, he's probably still alive, Malcolm Miller,
Oh, yeah.
who is kind of the hunchback, the straight back of the Chartres Cathedral. He's English. He came to Chartres, must have been 45 years ago, as a young man, and learned every stone, every carving, every window, everything. And it is a very, very complex theology. The Chartres Cathedral indeed represents a cosmology of all contemporaneous human knowledge. Everything is in that cathedral. So Malcolm Miller gives lectures. He has books written about it. He actually, I think he can give degrees too.
Oh, can he?
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Certainly credits.
Mm.
Yes. From human theology, divine theology, to the labors of the month. I mean, there's nothing that's not depicted one way or another in this cathedral. I mean, indeed, this cathedral is kind of the symphonic composition. So here we go, and the multiplicity of the images is so overwhelming that plenty of art historians, medievalists, don't really know all. I mean, one has to go to Malcolm Miller.
Yeah.
He knows. He probably knows every one of them. So here we go. There's our throne of wisdom with Christ sitting in Mary's lap with two angels on each side. And that's our Pythagoras, by the way, the one from, we'll get to him. So images from this south arch, where the traditional representation of the throne of wisdom takes on a new and specific meaning. In fact, truly wisdom. Uniquely at Chartres, the throne is framed by the 7 liberal arts, carved into 2 here,
Oh, wow.
band-like structures or archvolts.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and there we go. So each of these arts is represented by a carved personification, because after in Italian is actually, in Latin actually, is feminine, so it would be a female figure. With the historical practitioner of the art carved immediately below. And then one of the practitioners, Boethius for instance, is Christian, and possibly a second, Donatus, also Christian. But the others are actually pagan, because the liberal arts come to us from Greece through Rome. So Boethius lived under Theodoric the Great, remember, and then he imprisoned him and killed him. The personifications are all female. Oh, here we go. In keeping with the feminine gender of the Latin ars. So, which is, and here we go. So to begin with the lower, here we go here. Angels are on the inner archfolds, except right here, because there was no room on the outer archfold for all the 7 liberal arts. Well, you know, there's 6 here, 6 there, so music just got shoved over. The Pythagoras. And to begin at the lower left of the outer. So Aristotle, this is the practitioner, a pagan practitioner. Aristotle bends over his writing, while personified logic stands above him with a staff in hand. Right there. Then above them is Cicero. Right here sits Cicero with a rhetoric, because he was an orator. So rhetoric is above him. Then Euclid, then we see Euclid, the mathematician, and then geometry is above him. So those are the 3 on one side. And then as we pass on the other side, we progress through the peak, and down we find Boethius. There's Boethius, and this is arithmetic with Boethius. And then there is astronomy above Ptolemy, and grammar above Priscian. I don't know who Priscian is. Our 6th century author of an 18-volume treatise on grammar, or perhaps it's Donatus. So that's, I know who that is, who was the tutor of Saint Jerome. And then you see music, our poor music is left an orphan. So what they do here is music, you see, and she has kind of bells in her hands and other musical instruments. And there sits Pythagoras, who is seen as a historical person who wrote so much about on music of the universe and mathematics thereby. I mean, they're not talking about pure music, they're talking about musical theory as originally Pythagoras represented. And we saw Pythagoras, remember, in the beginning? Yeah, okay. So, and here, for instance, is grammar, and look at grammar. I found one image of grammar. There she is, and she's got her work cut out for her. She's holding a book, and she's got her switch at the ready, her walloper at the ready, right here. And then there are 2 boys, and one boy is enjoying a good pull on the other boy's hair.
That's funny.
And the other boy is trying to actually to study.
That's funny.
Whereas the first boy just thinks that the boy is uncool in trying to study. So things never change. So that's what this is about. I think I mentioned before, but I forget in which lecture, that in Princeton University there's a reading room in the graduate college at the as you walk into the cloister in the upper right corner. If you go down the stairs, and there's this spectacular fireplace, and around the fireplace are the allegories carved in wood very beautifully of the 7 liberal arts, and the grammar is there with a whip. She looks like a witch. Oh, here it just says that since the figures of grammar and her fill this, then the music, and she has bells and strings. Below music, Pythagoras, her practitioner, is at work. Yeah. Should we go back to Pythagoras, or you remember?
I remember.
Do we remember?
Do you want to? I mean, you can.
No, it's okay. It's all right. So, and indeed, the school of Chartres was probably the most prominent at that time in the land.
If you want to go back to Pythagoras, don't let me stop.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
and they valued, and it was devoted to liberal arts as God-given resources for exploring and expressing the order of the universe. And as I had said before, particularly geometry, particularly mathematics, was of great importance. Fed by influx of text, yes. Yeah, so all of that was revived, and here you can see Chartres from up above. It has a very, very complex system of flying buttresses, because you see, in Paris, a flying buttress was an afterthought, whereas in Chartres it was already built with a flying buttress. So whatever calculations they could make and did, it was already designed to be supported by the buttresses, and the interior shows it as well. Yes, so here is the porter. Oh, the poem just says that the royal porter unites sacred and secular, faith and reason, liberal arts and divine wisdom. So it's sort of like the royal porter is medieval scholasticism in itself, trying to unite pagan wisdom with Christian theology. So it's all combined in there. So you see here, we are looking at the apse of Chartres, and this is definitely tripartite. And as you see, there are no columns anymore. These are all piers, and they continue all the way into these very powerful ribs. And the ribs almost interfere with the windows, and they kind of look like plowshares, almost. And I must say that the windows of Chartres are probably the best surviving windows the world around. There's just they were never destroyed, fortunately, during the French Revolution or at any other time. They did not all survive, but a lot of it survived. Yeah, okay. Before we go to the interior, let's look at these sculptures that are these very elongated columnar sculptures that we talked about before, that they have no function, and one kind of wonders why are they. We don't exactly know who they are, because there are no signs underneath them, but supposedly they are kings and queens of the Old Testament. And where the medieval sculptors got this idea of elongation, well, one thing of course is that they follow the column, just as sculpture follows architecture at this point. But then again, I mean, look at this. It's also, let's not forget that the medieval illumination goes back to the Irish monks, and book illumination never really stopped. And some of the images are quite spectacular. So when sculptors decide need a theme, need a composition, it makes perfect sense that they'll go to books, especially the books kept in the monastic library. And then also, perhaps you remember from the Romanesque manuscripts, that the initial letter was very important in Christian illuminations, and often that initial letter was a person. And this, for instance, this is Saint Augustine, that serves as initial letter for I in one of the reliquaries. So when you look at Saint Augustine, and you look at the statue from the royal portal, you see very much the connection. There's also, this is from our Palatine Chapel in Palermo, and as I said, there was a great deal of relationship, economic, political, family relationship between the royal house of France and the royal house of Sicily, and there was much movement in between. And of course, and in Palermo by this time, this beautiful, beautiful cathedral is also being built with a great deal of Byzantine influences and Islamic influences, and we saw those Islamic influences already in Notre Dame in Paris. But here it's very possible that the same sort of elongated, this is a mosaic in fact, is elongated heavenly vision of the Eastern Church found its way into the royal portal of Chartres. Here, yes, and then above them, we see these little canopies that kind of they look like miniature cities. That is just so that the figures don't catch rain. And here is it's not the city. The city is not nearly as large as Paris, so there's room for the transept. And here is the transept, and the choir, you see, is even larger, in fact, than the nave, because the nave only has 2 side aisles, whereas the choir has 4, 2 on each side, and even the transept itself has side aisles. And that's the feature that was in Cernan, remember, in the Romanesque, in the pilgrimage church of Cernan, when the transept now acquired side aisles because of the influx of the population. And then the radiating chapels, and then the choir itself, as I said, has, and the ambulatory around the apse also has 2 walkways, and you can see it here. Again, the exoskeletonal principle can really be very easily, well, not very easily, I mean, obviously you're required to know something about it, but could be seen on, we began to see it actually in Saint-Cernin, that you can read the inside from the outside, and it is still very much the case in Chartres. And as you see, there's a very, very elaborate system of the flying buttresses, and here's our radiating chapels. And now this transept, right there, it also has its own portals, but they're very deep. That was built later in the 13th century, and these are very, very deep portals. Here's the entrance. Now, interestingly, Chartres still has a cylindrical column supporting its elevation, but this time this cylindrical column is not by itself. It now is surrounded, you see, by engaged colonnettes, and these engaged colonnettes go straight, they're pinched here a bit, but then they go straight up into the ceiling. And now this is the Laon interior, remember? It has 4-partite elevation and has a 6-partite groin vaulting up above, which by this time is felt that a little cumbersome. And then because you have this 6-partite vaulting, and then it has to be divided in between each section, whereas a 4-partite vaulting will lead straight into its own bay and will be read much cleaner, with much more clarity. And that's exactly what happens here. So there's a 4-partite bays, and each one goes into its own bay. It's a 3-partite elevation, and it's getting taller, you see, compared to Laon. It's getting higher. Well, it's because, you see, the gallery is now eliminated altogether in order to keep the wall transparent. The triforium is still left. Even now, the triforium is now divided into 4 parts, but the name is the name, so the name is still triforium, and this is, as I said, this is just carving into the thickness of the wall. And then the spectacular, absolutely phenomenal stained glass in Chartres, the original glass, which is very, very gorgeous. And you see our lancet windows up there, but what you see is that there's this tendency to cut out as much as possible the horizontal courses and instead to focus on the verticality as it goes to meet heaven. This is just to show you how complex the flying buttresses are. And remember that every flying buttress meets the interior. You see where the pinches are? The flying buttress is right there on the outside, catching the weight of the dome right here. And this is the transept. This is the crossing, and the crossing is supported by these enormous piers right there. That's what we're looking at. And in these piers, every line, every colonnade goes all into the ceiling. And so the aesthetic values, as I said, become the line values. Here, these are these piers. This is the transept here and the nave, and those piers are massive. I mean, you have to hold up so much, but by turning them into looking like an organ, really, one eliminates the idea of heaviness. Here, here's another photograph of the same, and we'll look at the stained glass. This is a very famous is this the north one? Yes. And then this is the apse, and you see how the piers go all the way. Then they so elegantly they split up at the pinching, and then half of them goes into the arch, and the other into the arch of the transept, and the other into the arch of the choir. I mean, it becomes an elegant experience. It becomes an aesthetic experience. It's the cathedral. This just to show you how you see these buttresses, they catch the vault right there, and then this one catches the roof, and this one in the middle is holding the whole structure up, and then it all disappears into this very thick buttress that sends the pressure down, and the side aisle is hidden underneath. And as you remember, we looked at some cathedrals, Durham, I think we looked at Durham. So what we had here was a gallery. It was not an open space. There was a gallery cut through, and the roof of the gallery, in fact, kind of served as this flying buttress, holding up the pressure and meeting the pressure from the side. This is still, I mean, one can actually purchase one is a shop, and one can actually purchase the do-it-yourself models and build them, and then you really, if one is interested, and then some children are, and some adults are, then you can really begin to understand how it's done, and that's really fascinating. The oldest glass in let's see. The oldest glass in the cathedral is from the late 12th century, and it's called La Notre-Dame de la Belle Verrière. And so the Our Lady of the Beautiful Canopy. And as I said, yeah, 1170. This one is. When one looks at the medieval stained glass, I mean, the two colors that immediately pop into our eyes are red and blue, and then of course there are greens and yellows, but mostly it's red and blue. And it took great skill, of course, to do them. The glass was specially colored, and then after it was colored, it was placed in a kiln to lock the colors, and then the glass was cut in a specific way, and then it was put in a frame. It was placed between lead borders, and then the whole thing was put in a frame, and the frame was bolted specifically to to the window opening, and in fact could be removed for cleaning, which is really awful that in Reims Cathedral, one of the kings demanded that be destroyed because his coronation was not seen well enough, because they could just be taken out.
Wow.
Because they were designed to be taken out for cleaning. Let's see. So it is Notre Dame de la. This one is even older than the Western windows. Western windows are unique in the sense, the object of devotion. Yes, they themselves became an icon. And it says, you know what, they say 11th, and this one says 1137. I have to double check. And blue Virgin against a red background. Yes, with Christ's child in her knees. So it's sort of the throne of wisdom in its own right. And then there was always a little lamp in front of it, because it kind of was deemed sacred and survived the devastating fire of 94, thankfully. So she survived, and the tunic survived. So these two very, very important items survived the fire. And here it just says, well, it's located on the south side of the cathedral, sort of as you walk in on the right, at the entrance to the choir. And all the bays are numbered, so this is bay number 14. And altogether there are 24 segments. The 3 at the bottom of the window are the 3 temptations of Christ. And then another 6 panels just tell the story of Christ. I mean, this is not the liberal arts, even though it looks like the throne of wisdom. This is dedicated to Christ exclusively. And then there are angels on the side. Well, the North Rose is probably the most famous of all shots. Do I have a better? Yeah. The North Rose is in a transept. It's in a northern transept, and it is very famous. In the center, Mary holds baby Jesus again. She's surrounded by doves, 4 doves, right here, and angels. And then 12 prophets encircle her in the diamond shapes. Okay, never mind, Luzerners. The lancet, the little lancet windows, right here, at either side, indicates the patron, and the patron was Blanche of Castile, who was the mother of Saint Louis, of Louis IX, and her and her royal lily is indicated there. She ruled as the regent of France in the 13th century, while Louis IX was a great crusader. He was constantly away in crusades, and his extremely capable mother ruled as a regent. And so everyone at the time would recognize that all these things here were sort of joint symbols of the queen, or of the kingdom of France and of Castile, because Blanche of Castile was from Spain originally. Here you can see the angels and the prophets, exekias, then the royal lilies, and here in the middle what we see now is the generation before Mary. So it is her mother now, Saint Anne, who is holding baby Mary now in her lap, and on each side of her, so this is the young virgin, and on each side is Solomon. This is David and Solomon. Here, fortunately, it's actually written who is who, so it's so much easier to know, obviously, when there is in fact a specification. So there's David, King David, and King Solomon, and very appropriately, King Solomon is actually represented as younger than David because, well, he was David's son. And then on the other side of them, there is a priest, Melchizedek, and another one whose name is Aaron, who was a companion, remember, of Moses, and sort of translated Hebrew.
He was his brother.
Well, yes. Okay. So each of the 4 Old Testament figures is on top of the heretical figures, such as King Saul committing suicide. Oh, I see. So those are the heretical. Oh no, this is just the lilies of France, and these are heretical figures whom they defeated. So the whole. And then labors of no, this is astrology and labors of the month. In other glass. So this is how the window looks, and I have friends who feel that you can see it best when the sun is not out, because then it sort of becomes like a jewel. Whereas when the sun is out, then it's almost blinding. I love it when the sun is out because you can really see it. And it's a beautiful, beautiful view. So as you see, this is on the left.
Getting it right here, folks. The hot topics that tear dinner parties apart.
Right, exactly. That's true.
It's better with the sun out. You're a madman.
Right, exactly. Well, on the left, you see this is the northern tower, so this is the left portal, and this is the right portal. And Christ is in the middle. You can see the roses, and again, theology is everywhere in each portal. And the Malcolm Miller could spend the entire semester just teaching the Chartres Cathedral, probably several semesters, in fact. But look at the what's happening. Because this is 12th century, 13th century. Here we have the royal portal, and we see these very, very elongated statues. But then something happens here in the south portal. Well, for one thing, they're shorter. They're still very elongated, but they're not as much as the royal portal. And then the very one on the left, Saint Theodore, I think he is. All of a sudden, he steps away from the column. I mean, even these figures do, to an extent. Not as much as these, but they are very strongly undercut. Whereas this one, I mean, perhaps a different sculptor cut him, really steps away. And we even see a hint of a contrapposto in him, a hint of maybe the belt, maybe it's the belt that emphasizes the different hips and the rising hair. But it almost feels as if his weight is on one leg and the other leg is becoming less engaged. It's almost as if we're back in ancient Greece, remember, in archaic into classical, when a very rigid figure of a Kouros statue suddenly acquires this counter posture, acquires balance, acquires elegance, acquires veracity. And that's what you see happening here. So this is what, 2,000 years later, essentially. What we see here is happening again. We go from archaic somewhere else into kind of naturalistic. In fact, and interestingly, the little canopies become more pronounced than the ones here. So this is the royal portal. Okay, and now we go to Amiens Cathedral, still in France, and a beautiful cathedral where Chartres is kind of the height, the medieval Renaissance. And now we go a bit into almost a Baroque stage. So this is more of a flamboyant style that we were talking about, instead of Raynaud, instead of, the rays. And these terms are taken from the rose window. So instead of the rays, now you have flame-like structures here, as you see. And very deep portal, both central and both on the sides. We have a gallery on the 1, 2, 3, 4. It's like it's 4-partite, 5-partite elevations. Hard to tell, because now the gallery is here and the royal personages have been moved up right below the window, and the whole fabric of the outside is becoming more and more and more transparent, and more lace-like. There's less and less solid wall. I mean, not that there wasn't much in Chartres, but still, this is becoming more and more so. It's beautiful in the cross section. It presents this spectacularly lovely sort of mathematical view of perfection, just as the scholastic medieval philosophers wanted to be, the true incarnation of God's design, as you see here. The elevation is 3-partite, and the naval arcade is becoming taller and taller and taller. Still triforium, very, very large, really large plate tracery windows right here. Here are the windows. There's triforium. There's the naval arcade. The principle of the columns is similar to Chartres. I mean, it's still a cylindrical column, but again with engaged colonnettes. And then the groins, it's a 4-partite nave, and the groins go directly to the bottom of the floor. And as you see here, when you look into right here, the horizontal string, it's there, but the image of horizontality is almost eliminated. I mean, we are presented very much with verticality. This is the nave, and we are in the side aisle. The side aisle is lower, of course, than the nave. But again, you see this here too. The stained glass was eliminated, destroyed, must have been. And I don't really know whether it was the French Revolution, very possible, or other reason. But the stained glass is not there, unfortunately. But you see the tendency to more cohesiveness, the tendency to this greater visual aesthetic of vertical lines, the tendency upwards to meet with one's mathematical maker, one's geometer, and you can imagine that in the Middle Ages, when as I said, when symbolism was truth, reality, revelation. One walked in and just caught one's breath. And here you can see very well the elevation and the 4-partite segments of the vault. This is actually a painting by one Charles Wilde in the 19th century, a painting of the choir of the Cathedral of Amiens, and look how tall the ambulatory is. Up, 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 and then the tracery, and then the beautiful windows. And here too, you see, here the groins kind of work like plowshares, almost cutting into the windows. I mean, they're stunning, all of these things. And here's the choir, you see, right there. But in, as I said, at the time in the Middle Ages, they would probably have a screen. The screens during the counter-reformations were taken down. So, and there's an example. Here's Notre Dame in Paris, and it's 108 feet, the naval arcade.
Wow.
I mean,
what an interesting growth.
Right?
That's really cool.
And here is Chartres, and that's 120. Mm-hmm. And here's Amiens. And you can see the elevation here and how elaborate the windows become. and it will go higher and higher and higher. Ah, our favorite, the Amiens Cathedral. Excuse me, the Reims Cathedral. It's actually, yeah, I mean, the idea here is the same as Chartres, the same square towers.
Same as
King's
Paris. Same as Paris.
What did I say?
Chartres.
No, the same as Paris. Yeah. Kings and queens were now moved upwards. There's absolutely no wall here. You can see right through. Yeah, you can see right into the flying buttresses. The timpano was eliminated altogether. It's a glass wall. I mean, this is the skyscraper now, where glass becomes a wall. There is no wall here, and look, even the gable has almost sculpture in the round there. Yeah. Now let's see. This is Saint-Denis, Paris. Where did we go? We went to Lyon. Reims is right next to Lyon, right there, slightly to the south, and then Chartres is the other way, and Amiens is directly to the north. What am I hearing? I don't think so. This is the now Villard de Oincourt. He actually lived in the 14th century, and he was a medieval architect, and he actually went from cathedral to cathedral, sketching the principle. I mean, sketching the disposition of the flying buttresses and comparing them to one another in various cathedrals.
Talk about having a passion.
I know, right? And here, look, you can see this is the buttress that meets. Here's the pinching. Meets the navel, the bolt, right there, and this is the buttress that meets the weight of the roof, and here they really are shown beautifully, and they're the pinnacles up there that kind of serve like nails to nail down with greater weight these. I mean, this is really perfect, the way it shows here, and as I said, we compared the Reims and Paris, and just a gorgeous cathedral. And this is still another painting by the same man of Reims Cathedral, which he did in the 18th century. It was terribly destroyed during the Second World War, and but they rebuilt it. Remember, by the time we got there, it was being rebuilt. I mean, it was already rebuilt, really, but it was, and in fact. The Germans aimed at it because it's probably one of the most gorgeous cathedrals in the world.
That's crazy.
Aimed at it to undermine the morale. So it was really badly destroyed.
That's crazy.
But reconstructed.
Good.
The French reconstructed it. Here it is. You can see the elevation, and did we see the map? It has, and you see here also, you can read it from the outside, it has 2 side aisles on the along the nave, but it becomes 4 side aisles in the choir, and then ambulatory and the apse. There's one ambulatory with the radiating chapels, which also sort of turned into glass, of course. There's the inside, and in Reims you can really see it. The same principle. You have the cylindrical column with the half colonnettes attached, and goes up, straight into the vault. The eye just follows all the colonnettes, and then one just decided to make something even taller, and so they decided that to build a cathedral in Beauvais to the height of practically 160 feet, whereas Amiens, you see, is almost 138, so more than 20 feet higher, And we really don't know what happened, because I mean basically they really knew how construct these cathedrals with all the supports that were needed. Maybe the foundations were at fault. Well, we don't know, but it collapsed.
Ooh.
The whole thing collapsed, and just the choir and the transept was left. But it's a stupendous structure, as you see, and you see the flying buttresses are supporting everything there, and it functions as a cathedral. Oops, what is this? Beauvais is right here. Right here is Beauvais. Amiens is right above it. Here's the chevet. Here's the choir from the outside, and there's the inside. Look at this. And here we have it. Paris 108, Chartres 120, Amiens 138, and Beauvais almost 160.
Wow.
Yes. And then they didn't do it anymore. They didn't try to go. But you see here, it's all light.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely light, and in the piers, all the piers go all the way up, and they themselves look like organ pipes.
Mm-hmm.
So we see the same, but the development was going up and up and up, and the vertical illusion was very, very important. And here you can compare. Look, the Laon could almost fit, in fact, into the naval arcade.
It's insane.
Right. This is where we began, and this is where we arrived. This is Reims. Okay, we're going back to Reims because we're going to talk more about cathedral sculpture. And we saw how cathedral sculpture developed in Chartres, from the royal portal to the southern portal, and you can see it even more so in Reims. This, for instance, right. This, for instance, this group is right here. As you walk into the cathedral, on the left, this is where that group is. It consists of Annunciation and Visitation. And visitation will become a very popular subject in Renaissance art, and it's about Mary when she's pregnant with Christ child, and she visits her elder cousin Elizabeth, who is in a more advanced stage of pregnancy with John the Baptist, and she's some sort of a cousin, twice removed. I don't know.
Are they attached to the back?
Yes.
They're not just in the round? They look like they're in the
round.
I know.
That's what they look like. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. You saw it, you just don't remember.
No, I remember it, but I didn't remember if they were attached.
Yeah, they're attached. Yeah, they're attached. So this is the first, and so it's called the Visitation. And in fact, in here you see a very youthful face of Mary and an older face of Elizabeth. And whoever the sculptor of this portion was, and you can see there are two different sculptors. He obviously saw the Roman sarcophaguses. He had been to Rome. He saw something. I mean, he saw how Romans portrayed their matrons and their young aristocratic ladies, because Elizabeth is very much portrayed as a Roman matron and almost in a toga, and Mary is portrayed as a young, noble young lady, and even the face is actually almost kind of Roman. In fact, but it's possible that by the time the artist came from Rome to Reims, or as the French say, Reims, he was so impressed with the toga and the folds that he just over-exaggerated the folds. There's so many folds. They are all around these two figures. But he certainly did remember the contrapposto, because there is no question that the hips of these women, the left hip and the left hip here, are up, that they're standing, that all the weight goes into the right leg. It's just that into the left leg, yes. It's just that the right leg should really be a little behind.
Now, how old would Elizabeth have been?
But 40? Still
Okay.
childbearing age, but
Okay.
yeah, whereas Mary, of course, was what, 13, 14?
Something.
Yeah.
14 by the point by this point in her pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
She was 13 at conception.
Right. So, such is this portion. But they're real women. They do not depend any longer on the column. They have completely, as Sasha just said, they kind of almost look like sculptures in the round.
Yeah.
They're certainly very deeply undercut.
I literally did not remember whether or not
Yeah.
they were just attached by feet and head, because I thought, are they just attached by feet and head?
No,
Because feet and head I can see.
No. They and then there is the Annunciation, of which we spoke often. Which Annunciation precedes pregnancy. Annunciation is the incarnation of Christ, and that's when the angel Gabriel, who is the messenger of God on high, who comes to this mortal girl who is 13 years old, and tells you that she's going to get pregnant, and whispers in sweet nothings into her ear. And according to Christian theology, the moment his words, Gabriel's words, hit Mary's ear, that's when incarnation happened in her body. That's the moment when she became pregnant. And so this is the first, and then after that comes, of course, when she's already pregnant, she comes to Elizabeth, and both of them rejoice in their pregnancy. I don't know if Joseph was rejoiced, but Mary's husband, but
He figured it out.
he figured it out.
They worked it out.
On the other side was clearly done by a different sculptor, because there's no this profusion of drapery, or profusion of pleats. Even though it creates a very interesting light and shadow effect, of course, but the drapery falls more innocently down, and you can, in fact, one of the first cases where you can see Mary's breasts protruding through the folds, whereas here, of course, you don't, because of the profusion of the folds. She's standing very calmly, listening to Gabriel. Now, we must understand that the head on Gabriel was added later. We don't know what that head looked like in the first place, but it's added from a different sculpture. And one of the wings, you see, is missing, and then the right arm and right hand are missing as well. But clearly, whoever added, and the head is smaller, much smaller than Mary's head, and even in proportion it is smaller, but it did follow the general gaze of the angel as the neck turned, and clearly they fit that. But whoever did this must have had kind of a sense of humor, because he's way too happy for his mission. He can't contain, and it's not really a happy smile, but more of
Glee.
What?
Glee. He's gleeful.
Glee,
He's
yes.
gleeful.
Yes, gleeful. And considering his left, when you see the left hand, and that's the real thing, and he's kind of lifting his toga, and his index finger is pointing down, and combined with the face, it kind of looks, doesn't look as if words of annunciation is all he's got for her. He kind of indicates that there may be more. And so whoever finished that sculpture, and whenever it was finished, as I said, must have had the sense of humor. And hold on, here. And here is the hand, as you see. And Mary is just standing there, listening politely, and submissively, because she is, excuse me, the handmaiden of God, after all. Let's see, where are we going? Oh, here, that's a good one. You can see it here. There's our angel. You see all these, these may have been labors of the month on the side, right there, but they're all destroyed, and they were also destroyed in the bombings. It's really awful. And then, so the Annunciation and Visitation are right here, as we walk past. But then we walk inside the cathedral, and turn to the left, and on the wall that faces, on the left side wall, the outer wall, we see, now these are sculptures in the round. And so sculpture went way ahead of course, all visual arts. And in fact, when painting begins to develop in Italy, in the first 14th, but then really in the early 15th century, many painters will go up north to see the sculpture in the Gothic cathedrals. But of course, painting could not develop up north because painting was not really necessary. It was, well, as I said before, in these cathedrals, it's the architect who became important. Not the there were no walls to paint.
It's so crazy the way these are done too, because it looks, maybe it's just the shadows, but you know in cartoons when a cartoon character runs through a wall and they leave behind their shape.
Yeah.
This kind of you have the figures, and then right behind them you have the niche in which the figure perfectly fits.
Right.
It's just no detail is too small for them.
I know. And the leaves here are all oak leaves now. There's no acanthus.
Oh.
It's the flora. It's the local flora. Now this night was added later. It's these two that are really phenomenal for the time, because this is 13th century, and we don't know what it's about. There's some sort of a communion, so it may be called the Knight's Communion because the man is dressed in full chain armor, and here is a monk, because lay clergy, I think at this point, were still disallowed beards. They had to shave, but the monks could wear beards. So there's the monk who is turning away from his makeshift altar and is offering a wafer, I suppose, to the knight. They're separated by a wall, almost sort of like a confessional, but one reads the whole thing without the wall. Here, this is the best I could come up, and you can see the oak leaves. And there's the knight. He used to have a sword. The sword was, it came out into our space, but it was broken off. And he is in full chainmail. He is off on the crusade. This is the age of crusades. And there is our Melchizedek, or David and Melchizedek, but knight on the crusade. And he is wearing this very naturally falling drapery, really spectacular drapery worthy of Renaissance sculptors, as he is offering this to the knight. So the sculpture has separated itself from architecture, and just as we saw within a century back in archaic Greece, from a rigid kouros he becomes a standing, very naturalistic youth. So here the difference, of course, is they can't be nude, they all have to be clothed. But the sculpture has become rather extraordinary. And thus we arrive at the 13th century, beautiful, beautiful little building. And it's called Sainte-Chapelle. It is in Paris. It's a 10-minute walk from Notre Dame on Ile Saint-Louis. And it's in the flamboyant style, as you see. Look, this all looks like very much like flames. It was very small, it was not that tall, and it didn't have side aisles, so it did not need the flying buttresses to go over the side aisles. and these very, very substantial, so staggering buttresses were enough. And it was a royal chapel, because this used to be, well, it's completely rebuilt, of course, now, but not the chapel, the palace around it. Today is the Palace of Justice. This is where the Minister of Justice sits, and very often you will not even be able to go into the chapel from the outside. You in fact have to go through the corridors of the ministry. But before the Louvre was built, this is where the French kings lived back in the 13th, 14th centuries, 15th century. And these windows are really, well, maybe a second to Chartres, but really on the same plateau as the window at Chartres. Now, this is the interior. Some of you may have been in Paris, in which case you probably were there. But I mean, talk of windows as walls, and here they are. This is the walls illuminated. I mean, you see the walls from the outside. Here, of course. But they're not walls, they're supports. They are these huge piers that actually support the whole structure, support the roof, support the vault, and in between there are these absolutely spectacular stained glass windows. Underneath there's a crypt that's been a little over restored, with a little too much enthusiasm. But I mean, it looks a bit Hollywoodish, but it's still beautiful. It's not Hollywood, it's Paris, and the concerts are given in the crypt and in the upper church.
Hollywood wishes it could look like this.
I know. Let's see. What I'm talking about here is the relics, the relics of the True Cross, and not only the True Cross, but also the crown were purchased by Saint Louis, by Louis IX, who in fact built Sainte-Chapelle as a reliquary. And it does. That's what it looks like. It's kind of a reliquary. It's a box. He built Sainte-Chapelle specifically for the crown of thorns, and at that time the kingdom, the Latin kingdom in Constantinople was not doing very well, and Baldwin II, who was sort of the last Latin emperor, really only existed with the help of Louis IX, but even then finally it wasn't enough, and he finally sold to him his most cherished possession, and that was the crown of Christ, which was deposited in, first in Notre Dame while Sainte-Chapelle was still being built, and then in Sainte-Chapelle. I think today it's I don't know where it is today. There we go. Stayed in Sainte-Chapelle till the French Revolution, and then after finding a home for a while in the library, in the National Library, it was restored to the church and was deposited. Oh, it's in the Cathedral of Notre Dame? No, it's not there anymore.
No.
Of course not. Oh, the relic was saved by members of the fire brigade.
Hey.
During the fire, and they probably went back to the library.
Wow, that was almost,
or Sainte-Chapelle.
That was almost a year ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
April the 15th. Yes, what's today?
Monday.
Yeah. Exactly. As I said, I mean,
The 13th.
Is it? Is that
Yeah.
what it is? Yeah. And as I said, the style was so popular, and so cohesive, and so satisfying in terms of the universal knowledge and cosmology, that in the north, I mean, you see, we are in the 15th century now. We're at the end of the 15th century now. Italian Renaissance is in full bloom. Raphael is born, Michelangelo is born. They're all working, 1490. They're all very much there until Raphael will die. Well, he was just born. And but Gothic is still going very, very strong in the north of Europe, and there's this delightful delightful little structure in Roma, they're not caring any longer for their vertical aspirations. This has become more decorative and very beautiful. And here you truly, I mean, look at the gables. There's no sculpture in the gables anymore. It's just the interlace, in fact, right there, and interlace. And there are three entrances. The front of the church is what's the word? Not concave. It's convex. It's a convex front, but only the three portals are functional, whereas the other two are blind. But the whole thing truly looks like a lace, like Belgian lace, and it's not far from Belgium either. Very, very beautiful. Here you can see it here. How these are the gables, and it's all the flamboyant style. There are more flamboyant here. It looks like Christ in Judgment in the tympanum. I can't see from here. I don't remember, but this is England. I think we've had really a lot of material for one evening, and so I'll post this here, and then we'll go to other countries and see how Gothic developed in other countries in the next lecture. Meanwhile, stay safe and goodbye.